You gave everything, they gave nothing back, then one day you stopped. You know that feeling, the one that lives just beneath the surface of everything you do, the feeling of giving, constantly giving. Your time, your energy, your attention, your patience, your understanding. Your late nights and your early mornings. Your emotional availability at hours when most people are asleep. Your willingness to show up again and again for someone who never quite manages to show up for you. You gave your best days to people who gave you their leftovers. You gave your full attention to people who were half present at best. You gave your deepest care to people who treated your heart like somewhere to wipe their hands. And you kept giving, not because you were stupid, not because you didn't notice the imbalance, but because somewhere inside you there was a voice that said, maybe if I give a little more, something will change. Maybe if I love them a little harder, they'll finally see it. Maybe if I stay a little longer, they'll become the person I believe they can be. So you stayed, and you gave, and you waited. And then one day something happened that nobody around you saw coming. You stopped, not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation or an ultimatum. You just stopped. And in that stopping, something changed that can never be fully undone. In this video, we're going to talk about what was really happening during all those years of giving. Why you kept giving even when you were running on empty. What was building underneath the surface that nobody could see, and what it means that you finally stopped. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying people like you, and what he found is not what most people expect. Stay with me, because this one is for you. Introduction. The person who gives everything. Let me describe someone. This person is the one people call when things fall apart. The one who picks up on the second ring. The one who shows up even when it's inconvenient, even when they are exhausted, even when they have their own things going on that nobody asks about. They remember everyone's anniversaries and nobody remembers theirs. They know everyone's struggles in detail and most people couldn't name one of theirs. They're always available and they're usually the last person anyone thinks to check on. They're thoughtful. Genuinely deeply thoughtful, not as a strategy, not to get something back, but because that's how they're wired. They feel other people's pain like it's their own. They can't watch someone suffer without wanting to help. They can't know someone is struggling without offering what they have. And what they have, they give freely. Their time, their energy, their wisdom, their presence, their care, their patience, their forgiveness, over and over and over again. They're the kind of person who makes a room feel safer just by being in it, who makes people feel heard in conversations that are entirely about the other person, who gives without keeping score because keeping score never even occurred to them. Does this person sound familiar? It might be someone you know, it might be someone you love, or it might be you, reading this, recognizing yourself in every line, if it is you. I want you to know something before we go any further. What happened to you was not okay. The imbalance was not fair. The fact that you kept giving to people who kept taking was not a character flaw. It was a wound that expressed itself as generosity. And Carl Jung would have understood exactly why. Part 1. Why you gave everything. The psychology beneath the giving. The first question Jung would ask is not why did they take so much. That answer is relatively simple. People take what's offered without consequence because human beings are wired to follow the path of least resistance. The more important question, the one that actually leads somewhere useful, is why did you give so much? And Jung's answer to that question is both more compassionate and more challenging than most people expect. He would say, you didn't give everything because you're a saint. You gave everything because somewhere in your history, you learned that giving was the price of being loved. This learning happens early, usually in childhood, and it doesn't always come from obviously bad situations. Sometimes it comes from a parent who was struggling, who was depressed or overwhelmed or absent in some essential way. And the child, with the limited understanding children have, concluded, if I make myself less of a burden, if I help more, if I need less, if I give more, maybe they'll be okay. Maybe things will be okay. Maybe I'll be safe. Sometimes it comes from a family where love was expressed through doing rather than being, where you felt most loved when you were most useful, where your worth was tied directly to your contribution. Sometimes it comes from a relationship that taught you through repeated experience that your needs are inconvenient, that asking for what you need creates conflict, that the safest thing is to focus entirely on the other person and hope that your own needs somehow get met in the process. However it happened, the lesson was the same. Give, keep giving, give more than you receive, and maybe if you give enough, you'll finally feel secure in being loved. Jung called this the foundation of what he described as the martyr complex. Not martyr in the dramatic, theatrical sense, but martyr in the quiet, everyday sense of someone who has organized their entire existence around sacrifice, around giving what they have and then giving what they don't have, around being endlessly available for everyone except themselves. And here's what's important to understand about this. It doesn't feel like a wound when you're in it. It feels like who you are. It feels like generosity, like love, like integrity, like the kind of person you've always wanted to be. Because the wound is so deep and so old that it predates your ability to examine it. It was there before you had the language to describe it, before you had the perspective to question it. It just became you, or at least the version of you that the world saw. Part 2, the persona, the mask you forgot you were wearing. Jung had a concept for this. He called it the persona. The persona is the mask you wear for the world, the role you play, the version of yourself you've constructed for external consumption. And for the person who gives everything, the persona is the helper, the supporter, the strong one, the one who's always there. This persona develops over time through feedback, through learning what gets you love and what gets you abandoned, through discovering that being needed feels safer than being vulnerable, through finding out that the helper role protects you from having to ask for anything yourself. And gradually, so gradually that you never quite noticed it happening, the persona became your entire identity. You forgot you were wearing a mask. You started to believe that this is who you are. The giving is not something you do, it's something you are, which means any suggestion that you should give less, need more, set a boundary, ask for something back, feels like a betrayal of your own character, like becoming someone you don't want to be. But that's just not me. I'm a giving person, I care about people, I don't keep score. And all of that might be true. But underneath the genuine care, underneath the real generosity, there's also something else. There's a person who never quite learned that they are allowed to receive, who never quite believed that their needs matter as much as everyone else's, who gave and gave and gave because stopping felt dangerous in a way they couldn't fully articulate. Jung would say, the giving is real, but it's mixed with something that isn't as pure as it looks. And until you're willing to look honestly at what that something is, you'll keep giving in ways that cost you more than they should. The persona is useful, but it is never the whole person. And when the persona becomes everything, when there's no space left for the actual self underneath, something eventually breaks. And when it breaks, it often breaks in the form of a day when you stop. Part 3, the shadow, what was building underneath. Here's where it gets important and honest. While you were giving everything, while you were showing up and supporting and forgiving and staying, something else was happening underneath, something that the giving was covering over. Jung called it the shadow, the accumulation of everything you refused to acknowledge in yourself. And for the eternal giver, the shadow was filling up with things they wouldn't let themselves feel. Anger. You were angry, genuinely, justifiably angry at the imbalance, at the taking, at the way your giving was treated as a given rather than a gift, at the way nobody seemed to notice what it cost you, but you wouldn't let yourself feel the anger, because anger felt selfish, because anger felt like it contradicted the kind of person you were trying to be, because anger felt dangerous in a way that had probably been true at some point in your history. So the anger went into the shadow, where it didn't disappear, where it accumulated. Resentment. Beneath the giving, beneath the patience, beneath the endless forgiveness, resentment was building, not because you're a resentful person, but because resentment is what happens when you consistently give more than you receive and you won't let yourself acknowledge that the imbalance is real. The resentment went into the shadow, where it grew, the need to receive. You needed things too, not just to give. You needed to be seen, to be checked on, to have someone show up for you the way you showed up for everyone else. To feel like your presence in someone's life was something they valued rather than something they assumed. But needing felt weak. Needing felt like asking for too much. Needing felt like becoming the kind of burden you'd spent your whole life trying not to be. So the need went into the shadow, where it hardened into grief, the truth about the relationship. You knew somewhere beneath the hope that the relationship wasn't what you wanted it to be, that the person you were giving to wasn't capable of or interested in giving back in the way you needed. That waiting for them to change was a form of waiting that had no end. But acknowledging that truth meant letting go of something you'd invested enormously in. So you kept hoping instead of knowing, and the truth went into the shadow. All of this, the anger, the resentment, the unmet needs, the unacknowledged truth, accumulated in the shadow over months and years. And the giving, paradoxically, was partly what allowed it to accumulate, Because as long as you were giving, you were doing something. You were active. You were focused outward. You were busy enough that you didn't have to sit with the weight of what was building inside. Until the weight exceeded what the giving could cover. And then one day you stopped. Part 4, the one-sided relationship. What was actually happening? Let's talk about the relationship itself. Because understanding the dynamic that was operating helps enormously in understanding why the stopping was not just inevitable but necessary. Jung had a specific way of describing relationships like this. He called them unconscious relationships. Not because the people in them weren't aware of each other, but because both people were playing out unconscious patterns rather than making genuine, conscious choices about how to relate. The giver was playing out an unconscious belief that love must be earned through sacrifice, that their worth in a relationship is directly proportional to what they contribute, that receiving is dangerous and giving is safe. The taker, and I use that word neutrally rather than judgmentally, was playing out their own unconscious pattern, often a belief that they are the center of things, that other people's feelings and needs are less real or less urgent than their own, that the giver's availability is a natural feature of the landscape rather than a costly choice someone is making on their behalf. Neither person sat down and consciously designed this dynamic. It emerged from two sets of unconscious patterns that happened to fit together in a way that was comfortable for one person and costly for the other. And here's the crucial thing that Jung would point out. The dynamic was maintained by both people, not equally, not in the same way. The cost was not equally distributed. The giver paid far more, but the giver was not simply a passive victim of the taker's selfishness. The giver was an active participant in maintaining a dynamic that at some level felt familiar, even comfortable, even safe. In the way that familiar things feel safe even when they're hurting you. This is not blame. This is the opposite of blame, because understanding your participation in a dynamic is the thing that gives you power to change it. As long as you see yourself as purely a victim of what someone else did to you, you have no agency, no ability to do anything differently. But when you understand that you were playing a role, when you see that the giving wasn't just love, it was also a wound expressing itself as love, you have something you didn't have before. You have a choice. And then one day you stopped was the moment you finally used it. Part 5. The day you stopped, what actually happened. Let's talk about the stopping itself, because from the outside it probably looked sudden, unexpected, maybe even cruel. She was always so giving and then she just changed. He was the most patient person I knew and then out of nowhere he cut me off. I don't understand, nothing happened, they just stopped. Nothing about it was sudden, and everything about it had been happening for a very long time. The stopping was the surface event, the visible moment, the thing people noticed, but what actually happened was much deeper and much older than one day. What happened was the shadow finally broke through, all of that accumulated anger that was never expressed, all of that resentment that was never acknowledged, all of those unmet needs that were never voiced, all of that truth that was never faced. It reached a threshold, a point where the weight of the suppressed shadow exceeded the capacity of the persona to keep covering it, and the persona cracked, not explosively usually. The eternal giver rarely goes out in a dramatic blaze. More often the stopping is quiet, internal, a shift that happens beneath the surface and only becomes visible gradually. You stop initiating contact, you stop following up, you stop checking in, you stop rescuing. You stop explaining yourself, you stop trying to make them understand, you just withdraw back into yourself, back into the space you'd been living in for everyone else for so long, and people around you call this a change, a shift. Sometimes they call it coldness or selfishness or abandonment, but Jung would call it something else. He would call it the beginning of individuation. The first step of becoming fully yourself, not the role, not the persona, not the helper, but the actual person underneath all of that. The person with needs and limits and the absolute right to receive as well as give. The stopping was not a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. Part 6. Why the stopping felt different from anything before. If you've been through this, if you've been the person who finally stopped, you probably remember something specific about how it felt. It didn't feel like the anger you'd suppressed. It didn't feel like the resentment you'd pushed down. It didn't feel like any of the emotions you'd been managing and controlling and hiding for so long. It felt different, quieter, more final, almost like peace, but not the peace of resolution, the peace of acceptance. Jung would recognize this feeling immediately. He had a name for the specific psychological moment when the unconscious material has been building so long that the conscious mind finally stops fighting it. He called it the moment of enantiodromia, a term he borrowed from the ancient philosopher Heraclitus that means the conversion of something into its opposite when it reaches its extreme. When you push a river too hard in one direction for too long, eventually it turns and goes the other way. When you suppress your own needs completely for long enough, eventually something in you stops suppressing and starts asserting. When you give endlessly without receiving for long enough, eventually the giving simply runs out, not because you became a different person, but because you reached the natural limit of what any human being can sustain without reciprocity. And the feeling of that limit being reached is not explosive. It's not dramatic. It's strangely calm. It feels like knowing, like finally, clearly, without any drama or confusion, knowing that something is over. Not with anger, not with grief, not with the desperate need to be understood that had characterized so much of the relationship before, just knowing, quietly and completely. Jung described a patient who went through something very similar, a woman who had given everything in her marriage for nearly 2 decades, who had been patient and understanding and endlessly available, who had loved with a completeness that was never matched. And one day she simply knew it was over, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the last piece of hope she'd been carrying quietly dissolved. And what was left underneath the hope was a clarity she hadn't had access to before. She told Jung, "I'm not even sad, I just know." And Jung said that "I just know" is one of the most psychologically significant things a person can say, because it means the unconscious and the conscious have finally arrived at the same place. The truth that the unconscious had been carrying for a very long time had finally been allowed into consciousness, and once that happens, once you just know, there's no going back to not knowing. Part 7. What happens to them after you stop? Let's talk about what happens on the other side of your stopping. Because the person who received your endless giving, the person who benefited from your patience and your availability and your care, is about to discover something. They're about to discover what was actually there. While you were giving, your presence was so consistent, so reliable, so permanent feeling that it became invisible, like the air. You don't think about the air until it's gone. That's what you were, the air in that relationship. So essential, so constant, so taken for granted that your existence was assumed rather than appreciated. And then you stopped, and the air disappeared. And suddenly the person who never noticed what you were doing noticed, not always immediately. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes they find other sources of air, other people who are willing to give what you were giving, and they move on without looking back. But sometimes, and this is the part that Jung found most psychologically revealing, they don't move on, they feel it. They feel the absence of what you were giving in a way they never felt the presence of it. They start to reach out, to text when you don't initiate, to show up when you're no longer showing up for them, to suddenly have time and interest and availability that they somehow never had when you needed it. And they might call this love. They might call it finally seeing what they had. They might call it growth or change or realization. But Jung would look at this more carefully, and he would ask, is this genuine growth? Is this a real change in the underlying pattern, or is this just the loss response? The reaction to the supply being cut off. Because there's a significant difference between someone who has genuinely examined their own patterns and chosen to change, and someone who is simply trying to restore access to something that met their needs. Real change looks like accountability, like genuine reflection on the imbalance, like taking responsibility for what they didn't give, like understanding without being told what it cost you. The loss response looks like pursuit, like suddenly being available now that you're not, like love bombing that mirrors the original love bombing of the beginning, like promises that are about getting you back rather than about becoming different. And the person who gave everything for so long, the person who finally stopped, has a particular vulnerability to the loss response, because it looks like what they always wanted. It looks like finally being valued, like finally mattering to someone who didn't seem to notice them before. Jung would say, pay attention to what's actually being offered, not what it feels like, what it actually is. Is this person offering genuine change, or are they offering the return of the dynamic that hurt you? Because going back to what hurt you because they finally noticed you're gone is not healing. It's the oldest trap in the story. Part 8, the guilt why stopping feels wrong. Here's something that almost everyone who stops goes through. The guilt, even though you gave everything, Even though the imbalance was real and significant and costly, even though the stopping was necessary and earned and long overdue, you feel guilty. You feel guilty for finally putting yourself first. You feel guilty for the pain your absence might be causing. You feel guilty for being the one who changed the dynamic. You feel guilty for not being there anymore for someone who, even now, you might still care about. And this guilt is one of the most important things to understand, because it tells you everything about why you gave so much for so long. Jung would say, the guilt is the old pattern trying to reassert itself. The guilt is the internalized voice of everyone who ever taught you that your needs come last, that good people sacrifice, that love means putting others first regardless of the cost to yourself, that stopping is abandonment and abandonment is the worst thing you can be guilty of. The guilt is the persona fighting to maintain itself, because the persona was the helper, and helpers don't stop. But here's what Jung understood that the guilt doesn't want you to know. The guilt is lying to you, not about the fact that your stopping might cause pain. It might. Pain that someone feels when their source of unconditional giving is removed is real pain. Even if that pain is, at its root, about losing a supply rather than losing a person. But the guilt is lying about what the stopping means about you. It is not selfish to stop giving what is not being received as a gift. It is not abandonment to withdraw from a relationship that was slowly consuming you. It is not cruelty to finally honor your own limits after years of ignoring them. It is, in Jung's understanding, the most important form of self-respect, and self-respect, the genuine, grounded, non-performative kind, is not something you're born with, it's something you earn, often through exactly this kind of painful, guilt-laden, deeply uncomfortable process of finally choosing yourself when everything in your history tells you that you shouldn't. Part 9. What the stopping is really about individuation. Now we get to the deepest part. The part that transforms what might look like just a painful relationship story into something much more significant. Jung believed that every human being has a fundamental psychological drive toward what he called individuation, toward becoming fully themselves, toward integrating all the fragmented, suppressed, denied parts of themselves into one whole, authentic person. And individuation, Jung was very clear about this, cannot happen while you are living entirely for others, not because caring for others is wrong, but because a life that has no room for your own authentic experience, a life that is entirely organized around what other people need, is not a whole life, it's a partial life, a life where one part of you is fully expressed and all the other parts are waiting. The giving part of you has had its full expression, for years, probably for most of your conscious life. But the receiving part, the part that needs, the part that wants, the part that has its own dreams and its own limits and its own absolutely legitimate claim on your time and energy, that part has been waiting. And the day you stopped was the day you finally gave that part some room, not because you planned it, not because you woke up one morning and decided to individuate, but because the psyche, which is always moving toward wholeness even when we're not consciously helping it, finally insisted. The stopping was not just a response to the relationship. It was the beginning of a return to yourself, a return to the person who was there before the giving became everything, before the helper role became your entire identity, before you learned that your value was contingent on your usefulness. Jung described this return as one of the most significant moments in a person's psychological life, the moment when what was always true about you, that you are a whole person with needs and limits and the absolute right to exist for yourself, finally becomes something you can actually feel rather than just intellectually understand. The return to self doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single dramatic moment of transformation. It's more like a gradual remembering of who you were before, of what you actually like and want and need, of what your own voice sounds like when it's not constantly occupied with attending to everyone else's voices, and it begins with the stopping. Part 10, who you become after you stop. This is the part that most people don't see coming. They expect the stopping to feel like loss. And for a while, it might. There's real grief in stepping back from something you invested enormously in, even when that thing was hurting you, even when the investment was never returned. But what comes after the grief? What Jung observed in person after person who went through this kind of fundamental shift is something unexpected, clarity, a kind of clarity that wasn't available before, Because when you're in the middle of giving everything, you don't have the bandwidth to see clearly. You're too busy, too focused outward, too consumed by the ongoing work of maintaining a dynamic that required constant effort. But when you stop, when the giving stops and the space opens up, you can finally see. You can see the relationship for what it actually was rather than what you hoped it might become. You can see yourself for who you actually are rather than who you were performing. You can see what you actually want from your life rather than what you've been settling for. And alongside the clarity comes something else. Energy, the energy that was going outward, all of it all the time for years, starts to come back slowly at first, then more consistently, and you start to discover what it feels like to have something for yourself, to use your own energy on your own life, to direct your attention toward what actually matters to you rather than toward what someone else needed from you. This is not selfishness. This is what wholeness feels like. Jung described it as the difference between a lamp that's been running on its last reserves, flickering, dim, unreliable, and a lamp that's been properly supplied, steady, bright, genuinely useful in a way that exhausted availability never was. You become more genuinely available to the people and things that deserve your presence, not because you're giving more, but because what you're giving is coming from a real place rather than from a depleted, desperate, I need to be needed place. The person you become after you stop is not colder, they're not more selfish, they're not less caring, they're more whole, and wholeness is not a limitation, it's the thing that makes everything else possible. Part 11, what Jung would tell you now if you could sit across from Carl Jung right now, if you could tell him your story. The giving and the waiting and the quiet day when you finally stopped. Here's what I believe he would say. He would say you were not wrong to give. The capacity to give deeply and genuinely is not something to be ashamed of. It is a real and valuable quality. It is, in fact, one of the things that makes certain people extraordinarily important in the world. But he would also say you were not giving from your wholeness. You were giving from your wound, and giving from a wound is not sustainable. It is not genuine generosity. It is the wound trying to heal itself through an action that cannot heal it. The wound that made you give everything. The early learning that love was conditional on sacrifice. Cannot be healed by more sacrifice. It can only be healed by receiving, by allowing yourself to be cared for, by discovering through actual experience rather than just intellectual understanding that you are worthy of being given to, not because of what you do, just because of who you are. He would say the day you stopped was not a failure. It was not cruelty. It was not giving up. It was your psyche finally insisting on its own survival, finally asserting the part of you that had been waiting patiently and painfully for permission to exist. And he would say one more thing, something that might be the most important of all. He would say, now comes the real work, not the work of deciding who to blame, not the work of processing the anger, though that matters, not the work of grieving the relationship, though that matters too. The real work is asking, why did I give so much? What was I trying to earn? What did I believe about my own worthiness that made sacrifice feel safer than receiving? Where did that belief come from? And is it actually true? These are the questions that change everything, not just this relationship, but all the ones that come after. Because until you understand the wound that drove the giving, you will find another version of the same dynamic. Another person who will take what you offer endlessly. Another relationship where you give everything and they give nothing back. The stopping is the beginning. The real work is what comes after. Part 12. A message for where you are right now. I want to speak directly to you now. Not about Jung, not about psychology, just directly to you. If you're watching this because you recognize yourself in the title, if you gave everything and they gave nothing back and then one day you stopped, I want you to hear something. What you did took courage, not the dramatic, obvious kind of courage, the quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal kind. The kind that nobody celebrates because from the outside it just looks like you changed, like you became less available, like you withdrew, but from the inside, from where you actually live. It was one of the hardest things you've ever done, because it required going against everything you'd been trained to believe about who you're supposed to be. It required disappointing people. And if you're the kind of person who gives everything, disappointing people is probably one of the most uncomfortable feelings you know. It required choosing yourself. And if you're the kind of person who gives everything, choosing yourself probably still feels a little bit wrong even though you know it's right. It required sitting with the guilt and the grief and the second guessing and choosing to stay stopped anyway. Even when part of you wanted to go back. even when the familiar pull of being needed called out to you, even when you missed what the relationship felt like before you saw it clearly. You stayed stopped, and that is not a small thing. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to expect reciprocity. You are allowed to stop when the giving is one-sided and the cost is your own disappearance. You are not too much. You were just in the wrong place, with the wrong person or the wrong people, and the stopping, as painful and confusing and guilt-laden as it might have felt, was the first step toward finding the right place, the right people, the right version of your own life. The version where you don't have to give everything just to feel like you're allowed to stay. Closing Jung spent his whole life studying what it means to be fully human. Not perfectly human, not selflessly human, not infinitely giving human, fully human. A full human being has the capacity to give and the capacity to receive. A full human being has generosity and limits. A full human being loves deeply and protects themselves. A full human being shows up for others and shows up for themselves. The person who gives everything and never receives is not fully human in Jung's sense. They are a fragment of a human, the giving fragment, beautifully developed, costly to maintain, and ultimately unsustainable. The day you stopped was the day you began moving toward wholeness, toward the full version of yourself that had been waiting patiently underneath the giving for as long as you can remember. That journey is not simple. It doesn't end with stopping. It begins there. But it is the most important journey you will ever take, because everything else, every relationship, every choice, every experience that comes after, is shaped by whether you make it or not. You gave everything, they gave nothing back. Then one day you stopped, and that day, that quiet, unremarkable, completely ordinary day when something finally shifted, was the first day of the rest of your actual life. Thank you for watching. If this spoke to something in you, please share it, because someone you know is in the middle of this right now, still giving, still waiting, still hoping that one more chance will be the one that finally changes things, and they need to hear that stopping is not failure, stopping is survival, stopping is the beginning. Subscribe for more content about psychology, relationships, and the deeper patterns of what it means to be human. See you in the next one.